as John Truby explains as you go through the book, this connect and compare ideas with the characters has to happen in the context of the theme. And he describes theme as your view on the proper way to act in the world, expressed through your characters as they take action in the plot. This is your idea of how to live, and each of the characters kind of represents a thought on how to live. Thus you have the face and the mastermind types. Yes, yes. Theme is not subject matter such as racism or freedom. Theme is your moral vision, your view of how to live well or badly, and it's unique for each story that you write. It's not just unique to each story that you write, it's unique to each writer and each story that you write. And this, again, it's like the heart of the value that you are offering as an artist is this unique perspective that you have. Nobody else has what you have. Nobody else is going to write what you're going to write. And it's all about this idea, what is models of ways to live, put in conflict with each other. So, John Truby has developed his formula for organically creating the hero and his opponents out of the theme, and it's called four-corner opposition. I'm really excited. I love this formula. It's been, and we're gonna get into examples of it. It's gonna be lots of fun. Okay, so four-corner opposition. John Truby said that if you view your story with the idea that it's just going to be one idea versus the other idea, it's this binary idea, and it lacks the ability to show a character within a society and show like how all of these different characters and ideas connect and put pressure on each other and work together as a society. And so he developed what he calls four-corner opposition. And basically four-corner opposition is, instead of having a binary idea, is that you have two values that are in conflict with each other. And so you could think of this as your binary, like if we were to take like this is not a negative and a positive idea. It's two ideas that conflict with one another. Like value one is loyalty and value two is purpose. And so if those come into conflict when your loyalty keeps you from pursuing your purpose, right? So this is not a positive and a negative like I outlined with the Snow White and the Huntsman, where it's okay, here's positive femininity and negative femininity. These are two values that are in conflict, that can come into conflict with one another. And so you start with those values, and then you take each value and you come up with the positive and the negative of that value, and that creates four corners. So I'm going to run through some examples of this that'll help kind of illuminate it, hopefully. And I'm going to use the villains that you guys all voted for in the polls in the group. So here's Hopper, because I wanted to start with him because he's just a super, Bug's Life is a super solid example of this idea. So usually you have your protagonist as the, okay, well, so what I identified as the values in A Bug's Life is the individual versus the system. That's the core conflict that's at play. And usually your protagonist is the positive of value one. So that's Flick, right? He's the protagonist of A Bug's Life. And I put him as the positive individuality because he's this inventor, he's creative, he is interested in expressing all of himself and pursuing his own dreams, right? And so he stands for individual and the promise and the, what would you call that? Just the potential of the individual. There's that whole speech that he and Dot have about the rock being a seed. You know, that's a really funny scene, but it's about how within us is this seed of potential, and all that we are is inside of it, and we're going to grow up into this big tree, who we are. You know, it's like this idea of the individual being potential. So there's the positive expression of the individual. The positive expression of the second value is the system, and this is portrayed in the character of Princess Ada, but it's really the ant colony altogether. But Princess Ada is the leader of the ant colony, and so she bears responsibility for it, and she kind of is the one who bears pressure on Flick. No, fall in line, do what everyone else is doing, because that's what we do. We're ants. This is how we support each other. This is what our system is. It works. It provides food. It keeps us safe. You have to stay within the system for the good of you and for the good of the colony. So it's a positive expression of that. The negative expression of these ideas is going to be the other characters, right? So the bug, the circus clowns, and this was one that wasn't quite as clear to me, because this opponent actually kind of gets neutralized pretty early on in the story. It's like they go to the ant colony and they're chased by the bird, and they do this daring rescue, and all of the ants love them, and that's kind of where this conflict comes to an end. But they're an expression of negative individuality, because they're all of these disparate artists, and I thought that was really insightful of the creators to make them artists and thespians, and like, right, these tend to be the super individual, unique, I do this for my art type of people, kind of cast out from the regular circles of society because of their individuality and their refusal to bow to the system, right? That's kind of the stereotype with artists. And so there are all these disparate artists who have no community. They have no grounding force to them, and they have no purpose besides just themselves and their art and pursuing that. And so that's the negative expression of the individual. They don't have structure, they don't have a system that they are a part of, that they're contributing to. And then Hopper is the negative expression of the system, because Hopper is all about enforcing the order, right? This is the way that it is. That's the whole speech between him and Princess Ada. The ants pick the food, the ants... I don't remember the whole line. What was the line? The ants pick the food, the grasshoppers eat the food, and everyone gets left alone or gets protected. That's the whole idea of Hopper. He is there to enforce his idea of order. And you'll usually see this as well, where the protagonist will be the positive of value 1, and the antagonist, so this is the main opponent who is putting the most pressure on the protagonist, will be the negative expression of the second value. And so they're diametrically opposed. But by offering more perspectives on the same conflict, it allows a lot more plot to exist and a lot more conflict to happen, because not only is Flick in conflict with Hopper, he's in conflict with Ada, and he's in conflict with the circus bugs. But the circus bugs are also in conflict with Hopper, and Ada's in conflict with Hopper, and Ada's also in conflict with the circus bugs. And so the levels of conflict, there can be an exponential level of conflict happening, because all of these characters have conflict with each other. They're not just in conflict with the protagonist. And what was I gonna... They all have things in conflict, and they all have things in common. And so sometimes when breaking down these stories, I could find kind of a label for the negative and positive that worked. It's not always the case, but on this one, what makes them negative and positive is that both Flick and Ada are have the purpose of the betterment of the colony. That's actually what makes them good, right? It's not just that Flick wants to pursue his own things for his own sake. All of his inventions, all of his ideas are to make life easier for the colony. All of his experimentation is directed toward life in the colony. He actually wants to do it for other people. And that's the difference between him and the circus bugs. And because they are just interested in their individuality for themselves and doing their own thing and doing it their way and suffering for their art and all of that. Same with Ada. She doesn't want the system to want the system. She actually wants it because she believes it's best for the colony, that this is what has worked, this is what has kept us safe. And when you rock the boat, Flick, you put us all in danger. You put the system in danger. And then obviously Hopper, he doesn't just want control. He doesn't just want order because he likes order. He wants to be in charge. It's his own self-interest. I want to be at the top of the order. And so this is Four Corner Opposition, and it's how you build out plot and opponents. And so answering your question, John, about an opponent who draws the hero towards their weakness, I think that all the opponents should draw the... Hey, there it is. I can turn on the laser pointer. I was wondering where that was. All of the opponents should put pressure on the protagonist, which pushes them toward their weakness. So the weakness is not a part of this, as you can see. That's part of building the individual character. But this is how the antagonist and the protagonist are connected. And sometimes you can use the different opponents to, like you said, one is kind of the face and the other is the mastermind. Or you could have one of them is a kind of like anti-hero where they actually kind of switch sides, or it's what John Truby calls a fake ally opponent. It's someone who seems like an ally at first, but then later is either revealed to become an opponent, or they actually shift to become an opponent. And so that's where this setup kind of really works, because when you actually build them to have values in common and values that oppose each other, such as Flick and Ada here, these characters could share the same purpose at the beginning of the story, but as the protagonist gets deeper and deeper into their weakness and they're acting out of their weakness and doing wrong things or doing at least unsuccessful things, the other character starts going, hey, that's not what I signed up for. I'm actually on this other team, or I'm not going to help you anymore, or you actually need to be stopped because you're hurting people and I'm going to stop. You know, they turn into an opponent through the story. This gives you lots and lots of avenues to play with and look at, and it also helps you just examine your core conflict much more closely. The interesting thing here, I think, is and we might see some examples of this, instead of seeing the antagonist over on the negative value of value 2, they might be over here as the negative value of value 1. And those stories are super interesting because these characters have a lot in common, right? These characters have like nothing in common. These characters have something in common. And so often the plot of a story where this is actually the main antagonist looks a lot different. It's more interesting to play with, because basically what you're saying is, oh, you think that the audience, you trick the audience into thinking that this is the core conflict to start with, the individual versus the system, or value 1 versus value 2. But through the course of the story, you reveal actually the core conflict that this story is actually about is this conflict, this positive and negative conflict. And so you end up saying something really different about the conflict when you rearrange the characters. Don't know if I've ever thought of Bug's Life like that, but that totally makes sense. I know, it was really interesting to take the examples that y'all suggested, because I wasn't looking for examples that fit into the Four Corner Opposition. I took the examples that you guys suggested and I went to see if I could apply Four Corner Opposition to them, and it was really a lot of fun. Let me fix this. It's bothering me. There we go. Okay. So to move on to another example, we're going to talk about another villain, and that is Azula. Azula was very interesting to figure out because she is part of the TV series, and in TV series you have so many characters, and actually you'll find that four corner opposition is more common in TV series because they're built on these casts of characters, and they have to kind of outline how all the characters could be in conflict with each other in different episodes. That's what you'll see in like a what's that called? An episode, or a like a I forgot the names of the different types of TV shows, but like, you know, like a cop show where the episode is kind of, they solve a mystery every time instead of being a series, like a whole through line of the character. I can't think of why I can't think of the name right now, but you just have this cast of characters, and they can kind of be reconfigured to be opponents or allies for each other however you like per episode, or per episode arc, or whatever you want to think about it. So you tend to find tons and tons of four corner oppositions, like here's the main four corner opposition, but then we'll take one of the characters and build three other characters around them that create a different four corner opposition, and that's what we see with Azula. So if we're going to start with the main four corner opposition for the entire series of The Last Airbender, we're going to start, of course, with the values that I think that are in conflict at the core of this. And the ones that I saw, somebody else could break it down a little bit differently, are responsibility versus entitlement. And so as usual, we're going to have our protagonist in the positive expression of the first value. Aang's journey is all about responsibility. It's what he struggles with, right? He constantly feels guilty that the world became what it did because he was missing for 100 years and he ran away from his destiny, and he feels majorly responsible for that, and he questions, should I run from this responsibility? How do I face this responsibility? Which pieces of this are my fault and things that I should take responsibility for, and which parts are other people's fault and I have nothing to do with, and just the responsibility of being the Avatar and having the weight of the world on his shoulders is something that he grapples with the entire series, right? Negative expression of responsibility is Zuko. What's Zuko's whole thing? It's regain my honor, right? But when we get into Zuko's backstory, we discover that what he did to lose his honor wasn't actually something that was dishonorable. And so he takes on this false responsibility. He feels responsible for things that were not his fault, that were not evil things to do. And he takes on the responsibility of this massive, overwhelming quest to capture the Avatar, which at the time he was tasked with that, nobody knew where the Avatar was or if he was still alive or anything like that. So this impossible task that he takes responsibility for, and he is struggling so hard with the weight of, and that's what Iroh is they're saying is like, this isn't actually your responsibility. This actually isn't a good course to take. But Zuko is so set in, I have to take responsibility for this, that it leads him to a lot of wrong actions. And this is an example of, like I said, a character shifting throughout the story, where he starts as an opponent but he becomes an ally as he changes. And so this four corner opposition is really only true for the first season. The second season is a little bit muggier, and definitely by the third season I wouldn't say that Zuko is one of Aang's main opponents anymore, but I think he's just a really good expression of the negative side of responsibility, false guilt, false responsibility. Alright, value 2 is entitlement, and of course, on the negative expression of entitlement, oh wait, okay, yeah, there's explain. Aang is legitimate responsibility, Zuko is wrongful responsibility. And we're going to see that tie over to the other ones. So the main antagonist of the entire series, of course, is Ozai, the Fire Lord, that dude. And so I put him as the negative of entitlement because he feels that he is entitled to the entire world. He can do whatever he wants. He can kill whoever he wants. He can subjugate whoever he wants because that is his right, his entitlement as the Fire Lord of the greatest expression of the Fire Nation ever to exist in this universe, right? That's that is the narrative of the Fire Nation, I guess, is that they're this great nation, and because they're better than everyone else, they have the right to subjugate and kill and destroy everyone else according to their whims. So that's the negative expression of entitlement. And the legitimate expression of entitlement, I would say, is the world itself. And this is expressed through a lot of different characters. This is usually the character that gets switched out per episode as they meet different people, as they travel the land. Sometimes it's even Katara and Sokka who are expressing this idea, but it's the rightful entitlement that the way the universe is set up, the Avatar is actually supposed to be the arbiter of all of these conflicts between the nations, right? And because he was gone, because he was missing, their world got decimated. And don't they have some legitimate entitlement to Aang's protection and judgment and his sacrifice, really? You know, don't they actually have claim to Aang as the Avatar, as their savior, as their protector? It's legitimate entitlement. And as he comes into conflict with all those different characters, that's kind of the discussion of like there's the one where he goes to the, what's that one? It's like a fire festival or something, and Kyoshi, they hold Kyoshi as guilty for all these crimes, and so they decide to hold Aang, put Aang through a trial in place of Kyoshi, who is a former Avatar. Right? That's the entitlement. We are entitled to judge you because of a previous Avatar's actions against us. And the whole conflict of that episode is Aang going, but that wasn't me. That wasn't my fault, right? You don't actually have entitlement to me. You can't claim that I'm responsible. And that's that whole conflict between responsibility and entitlement. So the villain that we're looking at here is Azula, though. So where Azula falls on here is she's kind of an expression of Ozai's will in the first couple seasons. So she kind of just falls into the same value bracket as Ozai. It's this entitlement to everything. It's when you get into some different four corner oppositions that you can really look at her personality. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at Azula in season 3 specifically. And I think she belongs as the villain to Zuko's protagonist. She's not really Aang's villain in season 3. It's Zuko who faces off with her at the end. So the values at play that I saw were excellence and mastery. And we're going to put Zuko in the positive expression of excellence. That's kind of his journey of season 3, is how do I become a good person, an excellent person? How do I pursue being a good person to the best of my ability, helping the right people to the best of my ability, my skills and my wisdom and my beliefs to the best of my ability. His whole focus is excellence. And I'm going to put Azula as the negative expression of that. So she doesn't really sit as the main antagonist for Zuko. And that's a little bit fudgy because some of the episodes she is, some of the episodes she isn't the main antagonist for Zuko. And so as far as building out the character web, though, I felt that this was where she belonged. What is Azula's character, right? It's like the perfection. I have to be perfect. That's her whole thing in the 3rd season. Not a hair out of line. Almost perfect is not good enough is kind of her thing. I would say that the trying to put a label on the positive and negative was possible in this circumstance, and it was the internal excellence versus external excellence, right? Zuko is concerned about what kind of person he is and his actions and his beliefs. Azula's interested in her image and her performance and her output, right? Internal versus external. So we stick Ozai in the negative of mastery, and Iroh goes in the positive of mastery. And Ozai is the expression of external mastery, right? Again, he wants to be in control of everyone else, master over everyone else, master over the world, master over all the power. That's his character. Iroh is again internal mastery, and he comes into conflict with Zuko in season 3 over that, over the fact that Zuko won't listen to him, that Zuko is not striving for excellence, that Zuko doesn't want to engage with everything that Iroh believes will make him a better person. And that's where they come into conflict, is that excellence versus mastery, and how, especially the second half of the 3rd season, Zuko goes wrong in his pursuit of excellence, because he believes that, okay, to be an excellent son, I have to do what my father says. To be the excellent prince, I have to act this way. And his struggle throughout the season is, okay, but that's not really excellent. That's not really what it means to be a good person, right? And so that's the excellent versus mastery idea, that in the pursuit of excellence, you can go wrong. But in the pursuit of mastery of yourself, internal mastery, Iroh is the expression of not going wrong, of holding true to your values, and seeing it through to the end. And John Truby talks about how when you're building out these characters, it's not that everything that they are is just this one idea. So excellence, Zuko is just going to personify excellence. That's all he's going to do. He says, no, it's these cluster of values that belong with this idea. And so you can kind of see that in these characters, because they're very, very iconic, and they're very unique, and they all have their own personalities, and that comes from kind of building out of these clusters of values that belong with where they're at around the center conflict. I'm reading the comments. Episodic versus serialized. Is that the names? For in my head, serialized means the episodic, but I that's backwards. It's episodic versus serialized. Yeah. I must restore my honor. Yes. Thanks so much for saying their names correctly. I'm a fan of the show, not a fan of the movie. Okay. Anyway, so just the reason that Avatar works, we all know so well, is because of how well built the characters are. And this is a lot of why. It's because there's a lot of thought and understanding put into the conflicts of the characters, but it's the values of the characters that these characters are built around are actually in conflict with one another in different ways. And so this is why TV show writers love this kind of stuff, because, right, we get episodes where Zuko's in conflict with Azula, we get episodes where Zuko's in conflict with Ozai, we get episodes where he's in conflict with Iroh, and he's in conflict with all of them, and then once he joins the gang, he's kind of in conflict with Katara, and he kind of transitions out of his own protagonist storyline for a while once he joins the gang, and he's part of Aang's four corner opposition again. But it's like Aang has two. He has like his external opponents, like Ozai, like what I laid out, Ozai and the other nations and blah 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 blah, and then he has like his internal ones as well, because often there'll be episodes where it's like Katara and Sokka and Zuko, or Katara and Sokka and Toph are all acting as opponents in this internal conflict that he's having, right? And so understanding all the values associated with all of your characters allows you to pair them in interesting ways that puts them in conflict and growth with one another, and that's the whole idea behind TV series, basically. And the other core idea of the TV series is that they're all stuck in a situation that they can't get out of, that puts them into conflict with each other as well. So Azula, looking at her specifically, when you take the pursuit of external excellence as your highest, deepest value, what you get is Azula, right? She values control. She cannot tolerate imperfection. She cannot tolerate it in anyone around her or anyone, or in herself as well. And that's her whole story with Ty Lee and May in the 3rd season. They become imperfect friends for her, and so she rejects them. She cannot tolerate them in her life anymore. So she values perfection and power, but what it causes in her is this massive insecurity, and we get a backstory for why that is. And that insecurity eventually is what cracks her sanity. She cannot cope with the idea that she is not perfect, and with the idea that she is not worthy to be loved, because she thinks that perfection is where her worth is. And so they built the values, and then they carried them out to the furthest conclusion. And that's where you end up with Azula. You know, why she makes such a great villain is both that they understood the core of her and they followed it all the way to the end. That makes her great. That makes the story great. But she was great before we got to that point, and it's because they understood what the root conflicts were and how she would use others' weakness against them. All right, next we're going to look at Snow White and the Huntsman again, to show you how this didn't apply to all the movies that I looked at. And maybe if they had done this for Snow White and the Huntsman, they would have could have fixed the ending a little bit, because it would have given them more plot and more interesting conflict happening on multiple angles. So like I said, I think it's about the feminine, but that's like one value. And so I was trying to think of what a different value could have been, and the most obvious is, let's see, we already went through that they're positive and negative expressions of the feminine, but the most obvious one that I could think of was the masculine. And then we're gonna get positive and negative examples of that. And in the characters that exist in the film, there's one obvious one for a negative expression, but like, he didn't really have his own values. You know what I mean? He was kind of just an extension of Ravenna in the film. He didn't stand for something different than Ravenna. And so Ravenna and him didn't exactly have conflict. He failed her, right? He fails in the task that she set him, and so she gets mad at him. That's not the same as conflict. And so that wasn't really terribly well built out. And then for the positive expression of masculine, we have several options, and there isn't really enough there in the characters to say which should be the option. And that's probably what I would have done, is built out one of these characters a little bit better, to kind of exemplify positive masculinity, or some, you know, it didn't even have to be masculinity. That was the other value, some other value that they were trying to portray, and make one of that character that expression of that value. But there's also 3 of them. You could make a second four-corner opposition for Snow and be like, okay, here's the huntsman, and here's her cousin or her friend, the prince, and here's the dwarves, and this is a different four-corner opposition that is maybe about faith or loyalty or inspiration or something like that, because that's really her relationship with all these characters, is she inspires hope in them again. But they're not really different from each other in terms of values. The huntsman has some backstory. William is her friend. These dwarves help her because, you know, dwarves are part of the story of Snow White, and so they have to be in it. But really, she performs the same function for all of them, and that's what I mean by I can't really differentiate from them enough to put one in this corner or to build out a different four-corner opposition. So if they had done this, it would have helped them define their conflict a little bit better and define their characters a little bit better, especially the prince. Like, I feel like they just created the huntsman character as the expression, or as the character that's in the movie, because they were like, hey, fake out. What if the prince doesn't kiss her? This huntsman does. And that's as far as they got with that thought. Like, they didn't really put thought into why. like when you look at the conflict, why should he kiss her instead of the prince? And what would that say about the story? And where would that go? Like, anyway, it just kind of falls apart when you try and figure out the system here that they're trying to portray. Never seen Avatar like 8 times, and you've never broken down the characters like that. Well, I hadn't either until I sat down to actually diagram it out, and I was like, what values could be here? Right. Alright, we can move on to the next example. This was another villain that was suggested in the polls, but this was in the villains that just failed entirely. And that is Whiplash from Iron Man 2. And Iron Man 2 was interesting to look at because, again, I couldn't really find a four-corner opposition. And what I mostly saw was, obviously there's Tony, who's the main character, and his conflict centers around the fact that he's dying, and he attempts to fix it, but he thinks there's not a way to fix it, and so for a large portion of the movie, he's just faced with his own mortality, right? That's kind of it. And that's his journey, is learning to be a good person in the face of mortality. But then he figures out how not to die, and we move on to action blowing up stuff. So really the only values that I could kind of find, and they're not really values, is there's this camp, which is there's Pepper, there's Rhodey, and then there's like all of S.H.I.E.L.D. So that's both Nick Fury and Coulson and Black Widow, who's introduced in this movie. And I couldn't really find a differentiation between those characters, so I just lumped them all together as like S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury's agenda. And that side is just, you know, Tony, get your act together. You are hurting us, you're hurting the world with how you're lashing out because, well, they don't know what's going on, but it's because he's dying, but they just see him being weird and crazy and an ass. And like, so basically all the conversations between Tony and them boil down to, Tony, get your act together. And then on the other side, we just have Destroy Tony Stark, and we have both Justin Hammer and Whiplash. And I watched a really interesting breakdown of this that was talking about how in some ways they were like trying to do this thing where these characters were a reflection of Tony. You know, Justin Hammer is Tony as he would have been without Iron Man, as he would have been as continuing to be this mega weapons dealer, showman ass who just did what he wanted and wanted to be at the top and prided himself in being successful and at the top and being able to have whatever he wanted. That's kind of Justin Hammer. And I could kind of see how Whiplash, they were trying to do, this is the other side of Tony, right? This is the inventor Tony. This is the Tony who put together Iron Man with a box of scraps in a cave, you know, that line. Like, that's supposed to be that expression of the character, but it really just, and he's supposed to have parallels as well, like his dad worked with Tony's dad, and that's kind of it. Tony's dad didn't love him, Ivan's dad did love him. Again, they're supposed to be like these parallels and comparisons, but they didn't really work because Destroy Tony Stark is not a conflict of values. I want to live, and I want you to die. And so it's really just the most basic level of conflict, and he didn't really have anything to do with the rest of the story. And the most basic level of conflict works for about one scene, and that's what we see with Whiplash, right? He has the one iconic scene with the whips on the racetrack, and he's destroying cars, and he's gonna hit Tony, and Tony gets the suitcase, and you know, all that sort of stuff. But after that, he doesn't really stand out in any way. He doesn't. I think part of the problem too is that Justin and Whiplash don't have any values, are not very different from each other. They kind of have the same value, which is Destroy Tony Stark. And so even though like Justin's using Ivan, and then Ivan like betrays him and ends up being the one at the end. What they're really just fighting over is who gets to destroy Tony Stark, and it's just not a compelling story at all. So I think if they had wanted to fix Iron Man 2, this is what the video suggested, was actually to get rid of Whiplash and to be more clear on what, like, make some of these characters the four-corner opposition. And you almost have a four-corner opposition where it's Tony and then these three, but these three don't really have different expressions of Tony, get your act together. Like, if you wanted to make them a four-corner opposition, you would have to give them different values on what get your act together looks like, or what they think a successful, happy Tony would look like. Or maybe happiness isn't even the value. So like Pepper, she's like, well, I just want you to be happy. And Rhodey's like, well, I just want you to be functional and to be a good person so that the United States Army doesn't have to worry about what you're doing with all of your impressive weaponry. And Nick Fury could be, well, I want you, I see so much more in you, you could be a hero, you know. And it's like there's little pieces of that, but they're not really outlined that way in the story. So anyway, I think that's Iron Man 2, and it's some of why it flopped, and definitely why Whiplash is just like there. He has that one memorable scene, and he could have been more if they had figured out how to build out the values a little bit better.